Last week, I invited my valued Patreon supporters to submit questions for a Q&A video, which they did. And so, as a special treat, on the day that the United States goes to elect its new president, a far-ranging discussion that, apart from this bit, doesn't talk about the election. I mean, not really. Some tangentially related stuff. I had two questions that hit broadly on the same theme. Jake asked, is social media getting worse and worse? Is there anything on the horizon that could push it in a better direction? And David asked, the age of disinformation is upon us. I realise some of the reason is that we are inundated with so much of it in so many forms, but it seems that the populace has gotten more gullible too. Any thoughts on the causes behind why we see so many things being taken as fact when they're, in some cases, obviously not? I think it's a number of things. The technology has made creating disinformation trivially easy and has rewarded outrage with virality, which is strongly desired by the platform users. Second, we have political polarization. We've gone through a period of the extremes of both sides doing patently ridiculous things on different issues. That has meant that people have developed the habit of discourse via pointing to the worst of the other side, either with humour or with outrage. That's a habit that persists, even when the extremes have slightly sobered up. I mean, I don't think we get as much complete woke nonsense as we did a couple of years ago, for example, but the outrage treadmill demands a constant stream. So what there is gets more amplified and the vacuum gets filled with fakes. Third, alongside political polarization has come post-truth politics as a specific strategy. It started with Russia, that simply lied shamelessly and with impunity and with strategic intent to poison the public information space. Then that was taken up by some Western politicians and post-truth politics became a thing. And you've ended up with a bunch of people who now have a certain mythology that they passionately want to believe. For example, that the current election is going to be stolen by fraud, or that Trump and his supporters are literally Nazis. I said we weren't going to talk about it. It's tangential. And they are hungry for anything that reinforces that mythology, the belief of which has become an important part of their identity. In one sense, none of that is new. I mean, I remember talking to people involved with the Troubles in Northern Ireland decades ago, and people were still viscerally angry about things that had happened hundreds of years in the past. And that was pre-internet, let alone pre-social media. But those communities found ways to keep the outrage fresh, to tell the mythologies that suited their sense of identity, and in so doing make it almost impossible for the people of today to put their differences to one side and move on. Now, Northern Ireland did finally find its way through that, although you'll still find plenty of echoes of it because such things do not pass quickly. But so too, maybe we will as well. Incidentally, the questioner also wondered if declining standards in education played a part. If you're not educating kids, they won't have the skills to figure out what's real/factual or not. Declining standards in education is a real problem, does have bad consequences. I'm not convinced this is one of them. I mean, it has been shown, for instance, that highly educated people are just as susceptible to conspiracy theories as less well-educated people. So I think it's more to do with the process of how people define themselves, where they find the acceptance of a peer group rather than education per se. I know that's not intuitive. I'm open to any research that says I'm wrong about that. As to Jake's question about whether there's anything pushing social media in a better direction, I'm not really convinced there is right now, no. I think social media will reflect and amplify the culture of the society it operates within. Because look, if we were fascinated by beauty and scientific discoveries and acts of great citizenship, then those things would go viral, and not someone pretending that their voting machine won't let them vote for Trump. It's the election again. All right. Jeff asked, evaluate the claim by Phineas Harper, The Guardian, that simply building more homes won't solve our housing crisis. I assume this refers to this article. Simply building more homes won't solve our housing crisis, says Phineas Harper, who looks about 12, but I expect that's just a bad photo. Scanning the article quickly, it seems he's saying that the principle that if you build more houses, then they become more affordable because supply is more in line with demand, that, he says, is wrong. The theory does not appear to work in practice. We are still building new homes faster than the population is growing. In 1971, there was almost one dwelling for every 3 people in the country. Today, there is one dwelling for every 2.25 people, meaning we actually have more homes per capita right now than we did 50 years ago. There is no unique housing shortage in Britain today, the housing lawyer Nick Bano tells me. He points out that we have roughly the same or more homes per capita as many European countries where housing is more affordable. He believes the root cause of intolerable housing costs is not a shortage of home, but lax rent regulations and dwindling council housing stocks. Okay, so this is not my area of expertise, but you can spot a simplistic equation right from the beginning in that argument. First, there are more homes per capita today than there were 50 years ago. Okay, I accept that, but what are the other relevant changing trends? So my impression, and where I would be researching if I was doing this as a proper deep dive video, is that we have more people living alone than used to be the case 50 years ago, and we have smaller families than we had 50 years ago. So describing it per capita doesn't in itself capture the levels of demand in the supply and demand equation. Second, yes, we may be at the same level as certain other European countries, but what else is going on here that may not be going on there? So, for instance, one of the reasons prices for homes in London are so much higher than many other cities, and hence pushing up the average price for the country, is that there are many wealthy foreigners, from Russian oligarchs to petrostate billionaires, owning significant amounts of property for occasional residence and money-making purposes. A quick and extremely non-thorough search on the topic finds research carried out by Dr. Philip Assar, Senior Lecturer in Economics at King's College London, which shows that with no foreign investment in the housing market in England and Wales between the years 2000 to 2014, house prices would be 19% lower than where they are now. So what does all that mean for Phineas Harper's arguments? It's hard to tell really, because his conclusion of that piece is somewhat anodyne. He says, the mature approach to achieving genuinely aspirational urban change is not to adopt uncritical blanket positions for or against development of any kind, but to weigh each project on its actual merits. That's not YIMBYism or NIMBYism, it's just common sense. Well, yeah, if someone's actually arguing for uncritical blanket approval for all development, however badly designed, then that would definitely be worth arguing against. But are they? Really? And in any case, his arguments don't fit the conclusion. As far as I can tell, he's arguing against a straw man, because it's not government policy just to approve all development, which is an easy way to make a living as a columnist. Alright, Justin has a question about the United Nations. I've shortened it, hopefully not to the detriment of its meaning. The ongoing conflict in the Middle East and Persia has put the United Nations in the spotlight on a number of issues, such as the evident ideological capture of UNRWA. Has the post-World War II model of UN-led conflict resolution been so undermined that it could go the way of the League of Nations? Maybe, but the purpose of the United Nations isn't purely about conflict resolution, and there are too many genuinely global issues and potential flashpoints for the world to conclude that there doesn't need to be an international body of some sort that is the meeting point for seeking answers. Any such body will suffer from problems of bloat over time, bureaucracy, occasional, although hopefully not endemic, corruption, and will find its makeup better suited for dealing with some situations and some conflicts and crises than it does others. But the real deciding factor will be the nature of the global order and what sort of international institution best fits it. The UN reflects the post-World War II world order, as you observed, created by the great powers at the time, dominated by the United States, hence why the US has often ignored the UN when it suits it. The UN founded on universal human rights, the inviolability of national borders, the desirability of global economic development, all of those things. The question is, what happens as the global power balances shift and change, and the dynamics and priorities change? If Russia and China and India increasingly define the world order and America continues its current decline, then at some point the demand will come for the international body to reflect the new realities. Now, that could result in the UN being replaced by a new body, as the League of Nations was by the UN. It could, alternatively, simply result in the UN being significantly reformed, so that the dominance of the current and emerging world powers is more in line, which is probably something that would only happen if the US becomes so enfeebled or so isolationist that it either chooses to let it happen, believing it doesn't really matter, or it finds itself unable to prevent it from happening because it's lost so much support globally. There are so many ifs and buts in projecting all of those scenarios. Don't underestimate, in the meantime, the number of good reasons there are to keep the existing organisation, most of which are completely out of sight of those making the apocalyptic pronouncements. But institutions do fall, and this one is seriously subject to the changing geopolitical dynamics. Just don't expect it to happen overnight. David gives me this, which isn't in the form of a question. I don't know if you missed the end bit, but it's a statement, so we'll respond to it. Methane is classed as having a GWP 100 score of 28. But as methane breaks down after about 10 years, the methane produced by ruminants, providing the number of animals doesn't increase, will be constant. Therefore, farm livestock do not increase the amount of methane in the atmosphere. That is my understanding as well. Of course, some others will argue that if the amount of livestock can be reduced, then the same dynamic means that the impact from methane in the atmosphere would go down much more quickly than CO2 ever would. But the debate tends to get distorted by the fact that there are a lot of campaigners for whom ending meat eating is a moral crusade, so who jumped onto climate change as the effective argument to support what they wanted to do anyway. In policy terms, if eating meat is something that is highly valued by society, which in societies worldwide it continues to be, then the logical policy response is, like the other things we highly value, like heating people's homes, you find the ways to do those things with reduced and eventually zero impact. I did a video that looked into the detail of this, which I will try to remember to link to this video up there or somewhere. Randall asks this: I'd like to know how much global temperature data has been adjusted and how much resolution is achievable in late 18th century up until the weather satellite age in areas where there are few weather stations. One definitely could not simply ask NOAA or Google for this type of data. You'd have to search for old data that existed before modern adjustments started to be done. Sorry, Randall, the premise of your question is based on misinformation. Raw historical data exists and is downloadable, always has been. The adjustments that are done for the different climate systems, they are all described in detail in peer-reviewed papers. Their purpose is to make trend data comparable over time, in spite of various changes that have taken place that would otherwise distort the record, such as what time of day measurements were taken, what types of thermometers were being used and when they changed, and so on. Again, I did a video looking at the detail of this, which has lots of references in the video description. The fact is that in spite of the misinformation that's out there, the overall impact of modern adjustments worldwide has not been to exaggerate warming, as you've probably been told, but actually the opposite. And if you believe that you couldn't simply ask NOAA for the data, I'm afraid you've swallowed someone's innuendo as to what the motivation of modern-day scientists is and how they work with data. My experience is you have to get that innuendo out of your head, accept the possibility that you've been manipulated before access to the data is going to make any difference at all. I can only wish you all the best wishes on that journey and point you again to the references in that video. Okay, a question from Gary, shortened again. For me, the most important issue is climate change, and from what I can tell, mankind's efforts to address it fall short of what is both necessary and possible. I don't think more scary science stories are going to significantly change that. I agree. It's partly because we define the problem as a science problem, whereas actually it's more to do with how you get a modern society of approaching 8 billion human beings to respond consistently over time to an invisible constraint problem. But anyway, Gary goes on to say, from what I can tell, our response falls into 3 buckets: personal actions, vote, protest. Now, he's still working his way to his point, but let me say something about that before we get there, because that list is about individual citizen action. Wider societal action is happening large scale, and it doesn't help the analysis not to recognise it. Most countries are making changes to the makeup of their energy production. They're constrained by various practical and political factors, but nevertheless the investments are significant, the trend is there, the direction of travel is clear. Many businesses are investing similarly in their own processes. Some are innovating the cleaner technology, hoping to profit from the needs of the future. Others are seeking to defend themselves from the consequences, such as businesses with agricultural supply chains, which are seeing the impact of climate change and looking how to make their processes more resilient. And yes, there are some businesses, particularly in the United States, who are also running interference to try to hold things back, preserve the old order long enough for them to squeeze as much profit out of their existing assets as they can. And that is a problem, not necessarily representative of business as a whole. So yeah, all of that stuff is going on right now. Is enough being done, and quickly enough? Again, it slightly depends on the problem you think we're solving. If it's just the problem that we have with the laws of physics, yes, and the laws of physics don't care about our politics and our problems, to be fair. But if it's just that, then on that basis the progress we're making is slower than it would need to be to avoid some of the bad consequences that we'd actually prefer not to have to endure. I mean, ask the people in Valencia in Spain. Skeptics can jump up and down every time somebody says something like that. Well, any time those extremes happen, they're always saying there's no evidence that incident was caused by climate change. The point is, it is entirely compatible with climate change. It's what we expect to see happen more often. In places like Southern Europe, we are seeing it happen more often, and Valencia is a potent illustration of the cost when it does. However, on some policy measures, we're moving too quickly. Poorly framed and unrealistic policy in the EU, for instance, has led to a significant backlash against net zero policies and the rise of a number of populist parties that offer the easy solution of pretending that climate change doesn't exist. There is no merit in coming up with radical policies that lose the support of your population, because then you get thrown out of office in favour of someone who promises just to reverse everything you did. Now, this brings us to the point where Gary was actually going. Rather than just protest in the streets, I think we need to more directly confront the corporate interests that are fighting against change. He highlights the carbon holiday boycott, where on a schedule of certain days in the year, large numbers of people make the commitment for that day to minimise energy use, to stay home, to avoid buying stuff. They say insanity is doing the same thing over and over, but expecting different results. I would like to hear you discuss options for achieving those different results. I'd like to hear you discuss protest movements in general. It made sense for the suffrage movement, civil rights and anti-war desires in the past. If ever there's an issue that could benefit from protest, I'd say it's climate change. Okay, protest movements in general. They have been important, obviously, in various parts of history and key moments when change had become possible or as part of a process that made change possible. The successful protest movements were those that had achievable goals, that had a clear analysis of the reality that they were trying to change, how it could change, and that had good quality leadership. The strategies they followed were appropriate to the goal they'd set themselves. They trained their people taking part to follow the discipline that would support the achievement of the goals. Now, modern protest movements usually fail on all of those counts. They fetishize structurelessness, so they're often incapable of following a strategy of any sort. Discipline? What's that? Let 1,000 flowers bloom, they say, which means anyone can do whatever crosses their mind as a fun thing to do. They tend not to have any sort of realistic view of the world they're trying to change, nor do they have a theory of change that would match the job. So you end up with the sort of protests that we get from Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, inconveniencing the public, making symbolic attacks on works of art and sporting events, and anything else that comes to mind that actually turn people against your own cause. What is the point? I mean, it gets attention, yes, fine, but to what end? The government of the country is already committed to a policy of net zero. The UK Committee on Climate Change produced a report showing all of the things that would have to happen to meet the extremely ambitious target of 2050 for net zero. All the details of why that's an ambitious timescale is in the report. None of the protests engage with that at all. Their demands are wholly disconnected from the choices that policymakers are actually facing. And that makes them not only irrelevant, which would be fine, I suppose, because everyone's entitled to a hobby, but it makes them potentially counterproductive because they end up doing stupid stuff that hurts people for no apparent reason and turns those people against their cause. When the pro-fossil fuel disinformation brigade made the truly dismal Climate the Movie, which I unpicked claim by claim on this channel, they used images of Extinction Rebellion protesters prominently in the video and in the promotion of the video. Why do we think they did that? Because the protesters had made themselves into a negative symbol that can be useful in rallying their supporter base. When your opponents are just pointing at you to gain support, you should at least suspect that it's because they think that you're damaging your own cause and helping theirs. Now, does that mean you couldn't have a smart protest movement on the issue? I think the answer to that is no, but the question would be, again, what is the theory of change for why it would speed positive change up rather than just making a noise and getting attention? Where are the factors where you could be on the side of ordinary people, associate yourself with those ordinary people rather than going out of your way to alienate yourself from them? Ultimately, public protest is better suited to a moment in time when a government has just done something egregious and the population wants to convey instantly in no uncertain terms that they disapprove. And those can be spontaneous and sometimes powerful protest movements. Or when you have a suppressed or subjugated subpopulation that is standing up for its rights and freedoms. Now, those can become more strategic and organised over a period of time. The famous successes, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the suffragettes, they all tend to be of that dynamic, a group demanding its basic rights. Protest movements to solve complex societal problems? You're into uncharted territory. And right now, they're failing to even understand the differences, and hence why they flail about, and they wonder why they're not being more successful. As for your specific carbon holiday proposal, it suffers from the tactical challenge that it will be wholly invisible below a certain level of recruitment. And since you're asking people to metaphorically wear hair shirts for a day, there's no compelling reason why large numbers of people would sign up. Personally, I would encourage young people to join the businesses and the other agencies that are practically innovating solutions and producing arguments and policies as a way to solve the problem. It doesn't have the heroic look at me quality that some of the campaigners thrive on, but it is more calibrated to actually solving problems in a productive and useful way. And it is also more compatible with the fact that the countries where the most pollution is currently being produced are not our own countries. But technology and solutions know no boundaries. Final question from Freedom Moped. One could argue that America is a nation of immigrants and always will be. Not so Britain, whose demographic has been relatively stable for 1,000 years. Given the recent overwhelming immigration introduced by both governments against the wishes of her people, does a route exist for Britons to regain their Anglo-Saxon homeland, or is it a straight choice between Islamization or civil war? Well, neither of those extremes. I think the backlash of the populist right across Europe has brought it home to governments of all stripes that immigration is a process that can only work if kept within limits, and that the degree to which immigrant populations are able to assimilate into the culture of the host country is also a key factor. In the UK, we have the forces of backlash ourselves that are not dominant, but they're sufficiently vigorous to do quite a bit of holding to account. The previous Conservative government provoked the backlash by presiding over a surge in immigration immediately after Brexit, which had been supposed to push it in the other direction. Some of the backlash is just populists spreading disinformation. Don't get taken in by them. Some of it's quite hateful stuff. The substantive pushback that can't be ignored, shouldn't be ignored, comes when some people see their communities rapidly changing around them, when you get ghettos where different rules seem to apply, which is a reference to Islamization in the question, I assume. There are answers to those problems well outside of that polar choice that you presented of capitulation or civil war. Honestly, the UK is nowhere near that mindset. The current government of Keir Starmer has said that it intends to cut immigration. Indeed, they've made it the theme of the week during the week that I'm shooting this video. Yesterday, announcing more money for a set of improvements to tackling illegal immigration, for instance. I think they probably will do so, over time, almost certainly imperfectly, but they will do so because they fear the consequences of not doing so. But no government will cut it to zero, because in a country with a declining population, the benefits of a controlled level of immigration are self-evident, certainly widely believed. And no, there is no idealised Anglo-Saxon homeland awaiting on the end of the process in any case. I doubt it ever existed, given the history of conflict through the ages the country has witnessed. I think what you're focusing on and identifying is actually something else, because there is a British culture with a particular outlook on the world and inheritance that can work extremely well with people who were born into it and with people who come in but wholeheartedly embrace it. It is common values that build a high-trust society, which is what people look towards in their homes. We need to make the distinction between a cohesive and high-trust functioning society, which we want, and the sort of blanket, angry, anti-immigrant sentiment spread by the actual genuine out-and-out racists. Because look, the new leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, is the British-born child of Nigerian parents. She is as committed to and as representative of those British values as anyone else in public life. Britons are rightly proud of the fact that Britain was the first to abolish slavery. Britain rejected Mosley's black shirts and all of those who came afterwards. That is part of the British values and heritage that I would hope we would be seeking to preserve. All right, thanks for the questions from Patreon supporters. By the way, if you decide that you would like to join those Patreon supporters for this channel, that obviously would be very welcome, but I have a request. Can I suggest that you either go to the website, patreon.com/Mallen Baker, or you do so via the Patreon app on your Android phone. If, like me, you have an Apple iPhone, please use the website to sign up, because starting very soon, Apple will be channeling all contributions via its app through its own system, whereby it then takes an enormous slice for itself. I'm reasonably sure Apple makes enough profit without taking the money that you intended to support me in making these videos. Anyway, thanks to all for the questions. See you next time.